This is a reading group on Simondon's Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information, Volume 2. We're reading the we're reading the chapter called Individuation and Invention in the text, the complement on the consequences of the notion of individuation. We're picking up from page 419 of the translation. So last time we saw the beginning of the text of the chapter on invention. We saw his argument about the technician, the figure of the technician, as this pure individual. So other social roles have this communitarian aspect to them. So a king or an old man or a youth or whatever social role. And the technician is this pure individual. And so he points to figures like Thales, who was able to predict the olive crop and buy up the crop and make a lot of money. So this figure of the technician is where we see the origin of philosophy in the ancient Greek world. The engineer who has a military role in the city-state. He's also the one who sort of first starts recording philosophical speculation of various kinds, and in particular starts to question or to differ from the existing religious explanations of phenomena. We see that some of the early pre-Socratics give non-religious explanations, what we would call, I guess, mechanical explanations of different phenomena of, the formation of living beings, and in particular, Democritus and Epicurus have atomistic explanations for how entities come to be formed. And then we also have, so he argues that there's a sort of a normativity of the technical object that sort of surpasses or it is outside of the normativity of the community in which the technical object is created. So technical objects have their own normativity. They set up their own norms of functioning, and so they serve as a sort of principle of transformation of a society or of a collective group of individuals. They don't integrate into the existing society in a straightforward way. They transform the set of norms that are present in that society. And he defines or he introduces this distinction between a community and a society, where a community is a grouping in which you have a sort of predetermined set of roles for the members of that community, and on the other hand, a society is a grouping of individuals that has an openness to it, and every grouping of humans is both a community and a society at the same time. So these are sort of two aspects of a collective, but there's an antagonism between them. So you can't understand collectives without understanding both sides at the same time. And then he talks about the role of invention in sort of instigating the openness of the society, and it's only in connection with this openness of the society that something like freedom is possible. It's the capacity to create a sort of self-generated value, or self-generated set of values. So freedom here doesn't have to do with freedom of choice, of selecting an option out of some set of options, but rather of generating a value or a set of values from within. And then let's see where else we have. And then we saw a little bit about the artistic object, which he assimilates to the technical object to some extent, but also contrasts with it. And so he talks about surrealism as this attempt to generate an art for art's sake, or to preserve something like art for art's sake. Um, and the surrealist art object ends up becoming a sort of machine to produce an experience, a singular experience. Um, and so it doesn't have the traditional role of being beautiful, or at least not necessarily beautiful, but it produces an experience. But then the sort of danger for any artistic movement or innovation is that it can sort of be reincorporated into a new community, so that the group of artists in some avant-garde movement can form like a new community of precisely the people that get this new art movement. um, and so the what on the one hand serves as a sort of uh, instigation of openness can be used on the other hand as a sort of formation of a new community and a new closed grouping. Um, yeah, so this we can maybe compare this to the War Machine and Capture by the State in A Thousand Plateaus. There's a similar sort of dynamic, uh, where you have something that can sort of escape from the integrated community, and then something that in that same escape can again be reincorporated. I think that's about where we left off. Oh no, sorry. The one last bit is about the machine, and what exactly a machine is and how it differs from a living being. And so he argues that a machine, as opposed, we have to understand a machine as opposed to a tool. So a tool extends or uh, protects an individual living being. So you can think of a hammer as a fist, but hardened and that doesn't feel pain. Um, there's like any tool is just an extension of the capacities of a living organism, whereas a machine stands in for the living organism, and there's a it's a sort of replacement for a living organism. And but unlike a living organism, it's not capable of revolting. And this is what Imodon takes as especially characteristic of a living being, whether it's an animal or a human, is that it can choose not to work or decide not to work, whereas a machine can only malfunction. Uh, and so the slave can decide, no matter how unlikely it is that I'm going to succeed, I'm going to try to escape, I'm going to revolt. Um, uh, Whereas the machine can only malfunction, even if we sometimes talk about a machine refusing to work. That's always sort of a metaphorical usage. And so machines can be adapted, so they can have a homeostatic operation. They can work in such a way that they preserve a certain goal state, or maintain a certain goal state, um, but they can't operate on their own system of operation, in the sense that the whatever if you have a thermostat, for example, that is set up to preserve temperature, the thermostat can't decide, I don't want to preserve temperature anymore. I'm going to preserve pressure instead, or something like that. Whereas a living being is capable of, and especially a human that has freedom in the sense that he wants to use it. A living being and a human is capable of operating on its own operation and selecting a principle of operation. Uh, and so this is what distinguishes a living individual, and a human in particular, from a machine. So that's, I think, where we left off. Um, I'll let someone else read from starting from this characteristic of discontinuity on page 419. If someone else would like to pick up from there.
Yeah, I can read. This characteristic of discontinuity, this existence of thresholds, does not appear in the automaton, since the automaton does not change structure. It does not incorporate the information that it acquires into its structure. There is never an incompatibility between the structure that the automaton possesses and the information that it acquires, because its structure in advance determines which type of information it can acquire. Thus, there is never a veritable problem of integration for the automaton, but merely a question of the preservation of information that is by definition integrable, since information is homogeneous with respect to the structure of the machine that has acquired it. Conversely, the individual possesses an open faculty for acquiring information, even if this information is not homogeneous with respect to its actual structure. Thus, in the individual, a certain margin remains between the actual structure and the acquired information, which, since it is heterogeneous with respect to the structure, requires the being's successive recastings and its capacity to call itself into question. This capacity to itself be one of the terms of the problem to be resolved does not exist for the machine. The machine has questions to solve, not problems, because the terms of the difficulty that the machine must resolve are homogeneous. On the contrary, the individual must resolve a difficulty that is not expressed in terms of homogeneous information, but consists of an object term and a subject term. This is why the teleological mechanism of technical beings is universally constituted by a circular causality. The signal of the difference between the pursued goal and the effectively attained result is fed back to the controls of the machine so as to direct a functioning that diminishes the gap that has caused the signal. This reactive causality adapts the machine, but in the case of the individual, the signal is not that of a discrepancy between an effective result and a desired result. It is that of a dissymmetry between two finalities, one realized as structure, the other of which is immanent to a set of information that is still enigmatic and nevertheless imbued with value. Clarity and compatibility do not appear in this virtual system unless the problem is resolved due to a structural change in the individual subject, according to an action that creates a veritable relation between the previously structured individual and its new charge of information. The notion of adaptation remains insufficient to account for the reality of the. It is, in fact, a question of a self-creation through abrupt leaps that reform the structure of the individual. The individual in its milieu does not merely encounter elements of exteriority to which it must adapt like an automatic machine. It also encounters information imbued with value that calls into question the orientation of its own teleological mechanisms. The individual integrates information through self-transmutation, which defines it as a dynamically unlimited being. The individual problematic is beyond the rapport between the being and its milieu. This problematic, in fact, requires solutions through overcoming, and not through the reduction of a discrepancy between a result and a goal. The individual problematic can only resolve through constructions, through an increase of information according to a divergent determinism, and not through a calculation. All machines are like calculating machines. Their axiomatic is fixed for their whole operation, and the fulfillment of the operation does not react upon the axiomatic. Conversely, the individual is a being in which the fulfillment of the operation reacts on the axiomatic via intense crises that are a recasting of the continuity of the machine's functioning as opposed to the continuity interspersed with discontinuities that characterize the individual's life. This makes me think of the section from Volume 1 where he talked about the collective as the resolution of the disparation between the anabolic and catabolic parts of the system of like an individual life. Because there he talked about the mature individual as a member of the collective because it has developed these structures and functions, but still retains the capacity to change them as the milieu changes. And so the sort of automatism of the machine here seems more like the way that the like elderly individual that has more, I guess, crystallized structures and functions can't really adapt to the milieu, but only kind of iterates the same functions and behaviors over and over.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think he makes a distinction a little bit earlier between adaptation and learning. So he wants to distinguish between these two terms, where adaptation would be a sort of accommodation to an environment, and this is something that a machine is capable of. So you can have machines that have teleological behavior in the sense that they have a goal state and they measure some property of the environment to see whether they're in their goal state or not, and then they do something to get closer to that goal state, and then they measure again, and so on. Um, and so this feedback loop, this is an adaptation mechanism, um, and this is something machines are capable of doing. Relatively, like even relatively simple machines, like steam engines in the 19th century had a governor that operates in such a way that it prevents the machine from overheating. Um, it slows the machine down if it gets too hot, or if it's running too high, and then it speeds the machine up if it's below a certain threshold. Uh, and so this is a relatively unsophisticated capacity of a machine, whereas a living being has the capacity not just to accommodate to an existing environment, but to um, integrate information that it receives from the environment. And so here, information we have to understand here not just as a certain signal of information, but in the sense that he understands it involving this disparation and a problem to be resolved. Um, so a living being is capable of solving a problem and not just of reducing the difference between a goal state and a measured state. And so in solving a problem, there's a certain creativity or innovation or something along those lines that is involved. So it's not just something that is a mechanical result of the initial conditions of the system, but there's a creativity involved in finding the solution to a problem. And what is um, characteristic of the mature individual, the individual at the peak of their powers, is precisely that capacity to solve problems in a creative way, so that they aren't confined to a fixed repertoire of behaviors, whereas the young individual doesn't yet have the capacity to creatively solve problems, and then the older individual no longer has that capacity because they have this fixed repertoire of behaviors. So this it's this capacity to solve problems creatively that is characteristic of uh, of individuals, of living beings, as opposed to machines.
It seems like there's a relationship here between the individual's ability to call itself into question and the solution of a problem, and the ability to sort of to redirect itself with regard to value, which I think is kind of the point he was making about the difference between the slave and the machine, and why it's possible for the former to revolt, because it can kind of change its valuation and decide not to work, as you put it earlier. But I'm not sure I totally understand um, how that calling into question relates to revaluation.
Yeah, I think the connection has to do with the way that value, as he described it at the beginning of this text, value has to do with a sort of making coherent of or making compatible of different elements of action, so that the slave can uh, you know sort of be safety or um, just sort of maintaining their current position, not making things worse, and so on. And so that's a particular that's a valuation sort of implicit in their action. Um, Whereas they can, for whatever reason, or maybe no reason at all, they can um, decide that this course of action, this preservation of safety or not making the situation worse is no longer sufficient for them, and they can decide that they're going to revolt or try to escape or whatever, refuse to work. Um, they and in doing so, they're sort of reformulating the priority of the different possible behaviors or different possible actions that they can take. Um, and whereas a machine doesn't have that capacity to reorient itself and reprioritize its capacities. It has the ability to accommodate itself to a particular goal state and uh, to act teleologically, but it doesn't have the capacity to determine the priority of those goals that it is operating in accordance with. It always has some fixed repertoire of goal states and actions that lead to an approximation to that goal state. It doesn't have the capacity to call into question, whether this goal is worth pursuing or whether a different goal is a better one. Um, and so I think that's sort of what the connection is between um, values as ways of making actions compatible and prioritizing actions, and then this capacity that the slave has to revolt, whereas the machine doesn't have that. I guess we can go on to the next bit. So I can read. Right. For this reason, reflection must refuse an identification between the automaton and the individual. The automaton can be the functional equivalent of life, where life includes functions of automatism, self-regulation, and homeostasis, but the automaton is never the functional equivalent of the individual. The automaton is communal and not individualized like a living being that can call itself into question. A pure community would behave like an automaton. It would elaborate a code of behaviors that is meant to prevent changes of structure and avoid the position of problems. The meaning of societies, which are synergistic groupings of individuals, on the contrary, lies in their search for the resolution of problems. Societies call their own existence into question, while communities seek to persevere in their being. Norbert Wiener has analyzed the way in which the community's powers of rigidity guarantee its homeostasis. The community tends to automatize the individuals that comprise it by giving them a pure functional state. From then on, the individual's capacity to call itself into question is dangerous for the stability of the. Indeed, nothing guarantees the synchronism of individual transformation. The inter-individual relation can be broken by a pure individual initiative. Consequently, as a superior formal coefficient that conditions the functional value of an individual, effective stability becomes the fundamental criterion that allows for the ongoing integration of the individual. This guarantee of continuity is also a guarantee of social automatism. This stability is the correlate of the community's capacity to. And yet these qualities of direct adaptation through assimilation and of structural stability define the perfect automaton. Every civilization requires a certain rate of automatism to guarantee its. Every civilization also needs the dynamism of societies, which alone have the capacity for a constructive and creative adaptation that does not lock itself into a stereotyped, unevolving, and hypertelic adaptation. Nevertheless, the human being is a fairly dangerous automaton that always risks inventing and equipping. The machine is an automaton that is superior to the human being, qua automaton, since it is more precise in its teleological mechanisms and more stable in its characteristics. So here again, we see this opposition between community and society, and the interaction between the two. So both are essential elements for any collective of human beings, a civilization, as he puts it here. There's a need for stability, which the communal side or the community side maintains. And then there's also a need for dynamism to prevent that community from becoming sort of stagnant. And that's what the society side provides. And so a pure community, a community without any society aspect would be a sort of automaton. So it would be adapted to a particular environment, but as soon as that environment changes, that community would be completely unadapted and it would have no capacity to respond to changes in its environment. And of course, human collectives or civilizations are always, to some extent at least, capable of adapting to changes in their environment. And the environment of a human collective is never static either. This was sort of the traditional colonial anthropology idea of the so-called primitive society was like supposed to be a static society where nothing changed. But of course, um, more recent um, more recent anthropology has shown that a lot of these societies have undergone significant changes, like changing from a sedentary to a nomadic way of life, or the other way around, and so on. Um, um, so there is no static uh, collectivity of human beings. There's always transformation in the environment that they have to operate in. And so, because of this, there can't be a pure community without any society aspect, without any sort of inner dynamism or capacity for transformation. Yeah, and it's interesting to sort of compare this with Marx. Uh, so and then this is also a sort of a difficult point in Marx interpretation as well, because he gives sort of different pictures in different uh, parts of his work, um, of what exactly the role of technical development is in relation to social development. So there are some passages where it seems like he's giving us a sort of technological determinism where the development of productive forces would be a sort of autonomous process, and it's just sort of reflected by social organization. But other passages, and I think those are the more, I think the more sort of authoritative passages are ones where he describes class struggle as the motor of history, or the sort of basis on which social change um, rests, rather than the development of the forces of production as a sort of autonomous process. So there's a um, rather than having like a technical determinism, there's a sort of complex interaction between the development of the productive forces and um, the social interaction, the class struggle within a given society. And in particular, when he talks about the development of machines or the introduction of machines into industrial production in uh, I think it's chapter 15 of Capital, Volume One. Um, he he talks about how machines are introduced uh, only, or they become adopted in industry in particular, as working the workers movement starts to become effective in imposing things like restrictions of the working day and so on. Um, so it's only once the workers are organized and start to be able to bring about transformations of the social order, even though they're fairly limited, things like a maximum working day. Uh, this leads to a different strategy for extracting surplus value. So rather than just extending the working day as long as possible, the capitalist class has to introduce machinery to increase the productivity of labor over a fixed working day. Um, and so there's an interaction between the social transformation and the technical transformation, and I think that's closer to what we see here with Simondon, where um, there certainly isn't a sort of social, a sort of technical determinism where technical development would sort of automatically bring about social transformation. Um, there's um, um, there's some sort of complicated interaction between social development and technical development in Simondon, as there is in Marx. So I wouldn't want to say that it's the same kind of interaction. Yeah, and I think you're right that there are sort of key passages, in particular the preface to the contributions to critique of political economy, which is sort of the main place where Marx talks about method. Is that preface, and in that passage, he it, it's easy to read what he writes there as being a sort of technical determinism where the forces of production develop autonomously, and then social organization is just a product or a consequence of the development of productive forces. Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't want to sort of derail our discussion too much into Marx's interpretation, but I would argue that other passages are uh, more characteristic of his developed position, which is not a technical determinism. But yeah, again, that's a little bit aside from our topic for today.
I can read from the next section.
Yeah, let's go on to the next section.
Section 4, the individuating attitude in the human relation to the invented technical being. The following question therefore arises. Which values are engaged in the relation of the individual to the technical being? We would like to show that every attempt to constitute a symmetrical relation between man and the technical being is just as destructive for the values of the individual as for those of the technical being. Indeed, one can try to identify the machine with the individual or the individual with the machine in an equally destructive way. In the first case, the machine becomes a property of man, and man takes great pride in his creature and only produces it so as to subjugate it to the needs or uses of each individual, thereby taking satisfaction from his mechanical servant down to his most singular fantasies. The taste for mechanisms in everyday life sometimes corresponds to an uninhibited desire to command through domination. Man behaves toward machines like a master toward his slaves, sometimes taking great joy in the excessive spectacle of their violent and dramatic destruction. This singular despotism of civilized man demonstrates a possible identification of man with mechanical beings. Circus games have evolved into competitions between machines, and gladiator fights have evolved into the demolition derbies of stock cars. Movies love to show the spectacular destruction of mechanical beings. The vision of machines can take an epic turn. Man rediscovers a certain primitiveness in this vision. But this attitude of man's superiority over the machine precisely corresponds above all to leisure activities, to the relaxation of humans no longer restrained by the community, whose compensation is simple tyranny over enslaved mechanical subjects. The inverse and complementary attitude is that of man and his communal function. There he serves the machine and is integrated into this vaster machine that the community is by serving his particular machine according to the fundamental values of the code of automatism. For example, the speed of responses to signals. Sometimes the machine itself bears the recorders that will allow the community to judge the behavior of man at work. Black box. The relation of the individual being to the community passes through the machine in a sufficiently industrialized civilization. Here the machine assimilates man by defining communal norms. Moreover, a supplementary normality arises from the machine when this normality is used to classify individuals according to their performances or aptitudes. No doubt it is never the machine that judges, since it is a pure automaton and is used only for calculating. But in order to be able to use the machine, men in their report of the machine must express themselves according to systems of information that are easily translatable with the machine's coding into a set of signals that have a meaning for the machine, i.e., that correspond to a determined functioning. This necessity for human action to be translatable into the language of automatism leads to a valorization of the stereotypy of behaviors. Lastly, the quantity of information itself in a relation of individual to individual becomes an obstacle to the transmission of this information via a path that utilizes automatism. For example, a civilization that adapts its means of communication to an automatic transmission of messages is led to replace the direct and particular expression of feelings in communal circumstances, already subject to definite uses, for more perfectly stereotyped formulas that are inscribed in fine print on an invoice at the Bureau of Departure and imprinted with ready-made formulas at the Bureau of Arrival. It then suffices to transmit the address of the addressee, the number of the formula, and the name of the sender. Here, the atypical individual becomes paralyzed in his choice, since no predictive formula corresponds quite exactly to what he wanted to express. The atypical, which costs the community a very large expenditure of information, is a deficient being once information is indirectly transmitted from individual to individual through the intermediary of a device that utilizes automatism. A voice too deep, too shrill, or too rich in harmonics is more deformed by telephonic transmission than a voice whose average frequencies are situated within the telephonic bands and do not pose any difficult problem to equipment relative to transmodulation. Normality becomes a norm, and the average characteristic becomes superior in a community wherein values have a statistical sense. Seems like part of what he's saying here is that in this second sort of inter-individual relation between the human and the machine, in which the human is subordinated to the machine, uh, information kind of only has the sense in which it's used in information theory. It's like the transmission of signals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think yeah, he defines two sort of opposed ways of relating the human being to the machine, which both are destructive, as he calls them. Um, so the one is where you just sort of subordinate the machine to the human being as uh, and so the machine is just taking the place of a slave. Um, and so here the machine is just sort of uh, an object on which the human being can sort of project their fantasies. Um, and so he talks about the demolition derbies and so on as like this fantasy of power of destroying. Um, and then the other attitude is the one that subordinates the human being to the machine in this communal function. And so in this attitude, um, there's there's no relationship between human beings except through these signals that are transmitted by a machine of some kind. And I think we can think here of like some of the email systems. Gmail does this, and I think Outlook as well, where if you open an email, it gives you like predicted responses, like thanks for sending this or whatever. That it thinks makes sense based on the content of the email. And so, of course, the more people use these predictive responses, the more communication tends to fall into sort of preset patterns. And the the danger of this type of stereotyped communication is that anything that lies outside of the sort of predefined set of signals is excluded or made much more difficult. Um, I was just trying to find, I think this story that I found here is about this topic, but there was something with film, like color film in particular, that there was some like technical choice or chemical choice that was made in like the early 20th century, where it was film was sort of optimized for uh, taking pictures of white people, and black people's skin shows up in, especially like dark skinned people, shows up in like sort of doesn't show up as well on film. um, and so like any sort of technical system that sort of limits the predefined set of messages or signals that can be received, it necessarily excludes certain people from or makes them less sort of uh, like treats them as exceptions or something like that. Uh, and then it treats other people as like the default setting. And so this is an example of this type of phenomenon. And then he also mentions here how the machine, like he's thinking, I think, of an industrial setting where the machine has recorders or of some kind that monitors the human behavior and subordinates that human behavior to some norm of communal functioning, like efficiency. And here we can think of I know in Amazon warehouses they have like um, their like handheld device that they use that says like go to row J, um, item 4 or whatever, and it says like it should take you precisely 76 seconds to walk there, and if you take like 78 seconds, then you lose points, um, and like the more you take more time to or like the more points you lose, the less likely you are to get shifts in the future and or get promoted or anything like that. Um, so that your entire behavior in like over your whole shift, like every second of your behavior is monitored, and you have to meet like this standard, which is like so anyone who was uh, injured or has a disability or whatever, um, you don't fit into this standard of like it should take you so many seconds to get this package. Um, that person is punished for not being up to the standard or not fitting into the standard. Um, so yeah, that's a particularly extreme instance uh, of this type of monitoring, but like any type of factory setting or a lot of different workplace settings involve this type of monitoring where the human being is monitored and made to operate as if they were a machine.
You're saying that we're starting extremes case of the old days of the USSR in some places in the USA.
Um, I think a lot of these technologies go back to the Taylor system from the early 20th century. Um, so Taylor came up with this idea of Frederick Taylor, I think was his name, came up with this idea that factories would be more efficient if you broke down every task into like the simplest possible components, and then you could measure those components and set up a time norm for each component. So, like, picking up a box should take 1 second, and then bringing the box to the shelf should take 3 seconds, and whatever, like, each step of the process should take a certain amount of time. And then you could set up.
Early, yeah, sorry. Early 20th century, that's the same time of the USSR, right?
Yeah, and I was just going to mention, yeah. So in the Soviet Union, they adopted some of the Taylor system methods to try
Is he
to
British?
increase productivity.
Is British guy? So sorry, what's his full name? Like, do you mind? Like, I'm gonna try to research.
It's Frederick Taylor, I believe, is his first name, Frederick.
Yeah, yeah, because I heard the same thing with Stalin. He did it on the drivers of the train stations. He used to, if they arrived 1 minute late with their train, he used to like threaten the drivers.
Yeah, I don't know about trains in particular, but I know that in factories in the 30s, they had some pretty strict rules about lateness. Like you could be, um, I think if you were like 20 minutes late, you were defined as being like absent for your shift, and you could be fired for being late. Um, yeah, so these sort of principles of subordinating the human being to a machine sort of uh, developed in the 20th century US were sort of exported around the world over the course of the 20th century.
Oh, so he's American. Frederick
Yeah,
Taylor.
yeah.
Yeah, there's always this struggle between how to avoid turning humans into machines, and there's a few countries in Scandinavia that decided to um introduce less hours of work, and like you can take a nap during work, and you can work less maybe take 4 days off a week, stuff like that. There's always this struggle between which one fits humans more.
Yeah, and this also ties in with what we were talking about earlier in connection with um, the Marxist theory of the development of technology, because one of the key struggles in the 19th century for workers was precisely around the length of the working day, where you had factories that were working like 16 plus hour shifts. Um, and workers, of course, were not especially happy to be working 16-hour shifts, and eventually were able to form organizations that were able to um, pressure the British state into imposing working hour restrictions, like the 10 hours bill. I forget exactly when that was passed, but um, restricting the length of the working day. Um, and so and then, as I mentioned, this development, this introduction of the 10 hours bill led to the introduction of machinery in a lot of industries that had previously not been mechanized. So there's again this interaction between the social organization and the technological development, um, in this case, driven in part by workers just wanting to have some time to themselves and not be in the factory, most of the working day.
Yeah, I saw this guy from Ontario. He was like in a few philosophy classes, and he's like part of the Italian anarchist bunch. And they were like he kept pressuring in every class to do a kind of like a militarized almost philosophy class, and everyone got annoyed, and like so many classes got cancelled because of that one person. Like he was acting really fascist, and like almost all the students ran away. So I guess like his idea didn't wasn't so successful.
Yeah, I don't know exactly who that was, but yeah, that's interesting.
There
Um,
are some bunch that call themselves Italian anarchists. I really didn't Google them yet. I have no idea what they do, but like this is what I heard. They keep calling them Italian anarchists.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, let's keep going forward with the text. So I can read the next bit here. So we're at the bottom of 422. However, these two inverse attitudes of stereotypy and fantasy, of private tyranny and communal slavery with respect to the technical object, stem from the fact that the relation between man and machine is not really dissymmetrical. It is a double assimilation, not a constructive analogical relation. Conversely, let's consider the noble relation between man and machine. It seeks to degrade neither of the terms. Its essence resides in the fact that this relation has the value of being. It has a doubly genetic function, both towards man and toward the machine, whereas in the two preceding cases, the machine and man were already fully constituted and defined the moment they would have encountered one another. In a veritable complementary relation, man must be considered as an incomplete being made whole thanks to the machine, whereas the machine in turn discovers its unity, finality, and connection with the ensemble of the technical world through its relation with man. Man and machine are mutually mediating because the machine possesses in its characteristics spatial integration and the capacity to preserve information through time, whereas man, through his faculties of knowledge and his power to act, knows how to integrate the machine into a universe of symbols that is not spatial temporal and into which the machine could never be integrated by itself. A relation is established between these two asymmetrical beings, due to which a double participation is realized. There is a chiasmus between two universes which would remain separate. It could be noted that the machine is based on human effort and that it is therefore part of the human world. But in fact, the machine incorporates a nature. It is made of matter, and it is directly inserted into spatial temporal determinism. Even though it originates with human labor, it conserves a relative independence with respect to its constructor. The machine can pass into other hands. It can become the link in a series that its inventor or constructor did not predict. Nevertheless, a machine only takes on its meaning in an ensemble of coordinated technical beings, and this coordination can only be thought by man and constructed by him, since it is not given in nature. Man confers on the machine an integration into the constructed world, within which it finds its functional definition through its relation to other machines. But it is the machine, and each machine in particular, that confers stability and reality onto this constructed world. The machine gives back to this constructed world part of the natural world, i.e., the condition of its materiality, its spatio-temporality, without which this constructed world would have no depth or consistency. In order for this condition between man and machine to exist, there must be a twofold condition in man and in machine. In man, there must be a technical culture, formed by intuitive and discursive, inductive and deductive knowledge of the apparatuses that constitute the machine, implying the awareness of the technical schemas and qualities materialized in the man must be familiar with the machine according to a knowledge that is adequate in its principles, details, and history. At that point, the machine will no longer be for him a simple instrument or a servant that never protests. Every machine crystallizes a certain number of efforts, intentions, and schemas, and it invests a certain aspect of the nature of chemical element. Its characteristics are mixtures of three things: technical schemas, properties of the elements of the constituents of matter, and the laws of the transformation of energy. True technical culture requires a scientific knowledge. It teaches us not to hold any particular being in contempt. Any technical being in contempt, including much older. In the old-fashioned or antiquated exterior characteristics, true technical culture rediscovers the meaning of a scientific law and the properties of a material element. The technical being grasped in its reality defines a certain mediation between man and the natural world. Technical culture allows us to grasp this mediation in its authentic reality. A technical taste can develop that is comparable to aesthetic taste and moral refinement. Many men have primitively and crudely in their relation to behave primitively and crudely in their relation to machines due to a lack of culture. The stability of a civilization that includes an increasingly large number of technical beings would be impossible to attain unless the relation between man and machine will be at equilibrium and imprinted with wisdom according to an interior restraint that only a technical culture can provide. The frenzy for possessing machines and the excessiveness of their utilization is comparable to a veritable disruption of mores. Machines are treated as consumer goods by a crude and ignorant humanity, which passionately throws itself on everything that presents a character of external and created novelty, to just as quickly toss them aside as soon as their novel qualities have been exhausted. Cultivated man must have a certain respect for the technical being, precisely because he knows its veritable structure and its real functioning. So here he's defining, as opposed to these two attitudes of either subordination of the machine to the human being or subordination of the human being to the machine, he's identifying an attitude in which there's a real relation between the human being and the machine. So it's a relation that has the status of being, in the sense that it's not a fully constituted human being and a fully constituted machine that sort of appear next to each other, but rather the human being and the machine are both transformed in the relation. So the relation is part of what constitutes the human being and part of what constitutes the machine. And so here, in order to operate under this attitude, you have to have something like a technical taste. So this is comparable to aesthetic taste or moral refinement. So it's similar to an appreciation for art or moral refinement or an attitude, a moral attitude, but it's an attitude towards machines. And so here, this is also connected with Simondon's biography to some extent, because he taught classes in technology at different institutions during his academic career, and so he tried to instill a sort of technical appreciation in his students, and it's this attitude of technical appreciation that is required to behave in accordance with this attitude of the interaction between the human and the machine. So you have to be able to understand the functioning of machines in terms of the technical principles that are at work in the workings of those machines, and you have to have a sort of attitude of appreciation for them that doesn't necessarily, so it doesn't sort of dismiss obsolete machines or obsolete technical equipment as being obsolete. It doesn't always need to have the latest model of phone or uh, something along those lines. It allows for an appreciation of something that is no longer high tech or at the peak of technical development, and you appreciate it for its own uh, functioning and how it works, rather than saying that this object is obsolete. Uh, and in the other book on the mode of existence of technical objects, he talks about having precisely this sort of appreciation for obsolete machines or obsolete technical objects, and sort of having an appreciation for those obsolete objects as being uh, characteristic of this technical cultivation. Yeah, and Angus has posted in the chat here this phrase "doubly genetic" that he used in this passage is helpful for thinking what he called dialectic in the last volume. Yeah, I think that's a good remark, because so we saw in towards the end of volume one where he sort of surprisingly used this term dialectic for exactly this type of relationship where you have um, these two terms that each constitute each other, or that are constituted at the same time out of this relationship. Um, Whereas in other parts of the text, he opposes his own system to the dialectic, and he sort of criticizes the dialectic for um, having this moment of negativity that he doesn't think is present in the transductive process. Um, but yeah, in that passage, he takes on the term dialectic, and I think we can probably identify or at least compare that usage of the term dialectic to this phrase, the doubly genetic. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. If someone else would like to read from The Truth and Authenticity.
I can read. The truth and authenticity of the machine must correspond to man's cultural refinement. However, insofar as human taste is corrupted, industrial civilization cannot produce truly authentic machines, because this production is subjected to trending commercial conditions. It then must contort itself to the conditions of opinion and collective taste. However, if we consider the machines that our civilization allows the individual to use, we will see that their technical characteristics are obliterated and concealed by an impenetrable rhetoric, covered over by a mythology and a collective magic that can hardly be elucidated or demystified. Today, a good portion of contemporary machines used in everyday life are nothing more than instruments of flattery. There is a sophistry of presentation that seeks to give a magical spin to the technical being in order to lull the individual's active powers to sleep and lead him into a hypnotic state wherein he experiences the pleasure of commanding a throng of mechanical slaves that are not very faithful or diligent, but are always flattering. An analysis of the luxurious characteristic of technical objects would reveal what deceptiveness they hold. For many apparatuses, the fetishism of the control panel conceals the poverty of technical devices, and the singular ignorance of their fabrication is hidden underneath an impressive streamlining. Sacrificing itself to a depraved taste, technical construction is an art of facade and sleight of hand. The state of hypnosis extends from the purchase to the utilization. In commercial propaganda itself, the technical being is already adorned with a certain communal signification. To buy an object is to acquire a title of belonging to a certain community. This is to aspire to a type of existence characterized by the possession of this object. The object is coveted as a sign of communal recognition, symbol in the Greek sense of the term. Then the state of hypnosis persists in its utilization, and the object is never known in its reality, but merely for what it represents. Consequently, besides the severe constraints that it imposes on the individual, the community offers a certain compensation that prevents the individual from revolting and having a keen awareness of his problems. The ever-latent state of restlessness is always deferred through technical hypnosis, and the individual's life ebbs and flows in a balancing act between the constraints of social rigidity and the gratifying states that the community procures through technical incantation. This state is stable since the commercialization of industry finds an easier path in the action upon collective opinion than in veritable research and real technical perfections, which would have no commercial values because they would remain misunderstood by the majority of people who are only informed by way of commercial pathways. To break this vicious circle, it is not enough to say that man must direct the machine instead of allowing himself to be enslaved by it. It must be understood that if the machine enslaves man, this is to the extent that man degrades the machine by turning it into a slave. If, instead of seeking states of hypnosis in the machine or a simple source of marvels for the ignorant, man associates the machine with states in which he is veritably active and creative, as is the case in scientific research, the communal aspect of the machine can disappear. If we consider the machines used in scientific research, we will see that even when they utilize a very complex automatism, they do not enslave man and are no longer enslaved by him. They are not the object of consumption, and they are no longer beings meant to produce a labor that is predetermined in its results, expected and demanded by the community, that forces its obligations on the individual. Should I just finish this section?
Yeah, might as well.
Okay. Under these conditions, the machine is integrated into the causal chain of human effort. The goal of this effort surpasses the machine that is put into action. The machine then realizes the mediation with respect to the object of research and not with respect to the community. It is erased from the individual's field of perception. The individual does not act on the machine, he acts on the object and observes the object through the machine. Due to the machine, a cycle is established that goes from the object to the subject and from the subject to the object. The machine extends and adapts the subject and the object to one another by way of a complex interlinking of causalities. The machine is a tool insofar as it allows for the subject to act on the object, and it is an instrument insofar as it brings signals coming from the object to the subject. It conveys, amplifies, transforms, translates, and conducts an action in one direction and an information in an inverse direction. It is both tool and motor at the same time. The reciprocal characteristic of this twofold relation ensures that man is not alienated in the presence of this machine. He remains man and it remains machine. The position of man and the position of machine are not symmetrical with respect to the object. The machine displays an immediate connection to the object, whereas man has immediate relation to it. The object and man are symmetrical with respect to the machine. Man creates the machine so that it can establish and develop this relation. This is why the relation to the machine is only legitimate if it flows through the machine without having as its destination the human in its communal form, but rather an object. The relation of man to machine is asymmetrical because this machine establishes a symmetrical relation between man and the world. So this is a little bit confusing to me because as you noted at the beginning of this session earlier, he distinguished between the tool and the machine. Now he's saying that, and if it's sort of properly appreciated, the machine is at least part tool, at least in the direction of from the subject to the object of research.
Yeah, he's here, I guess, qualifying that distinction between tool and machine that he made earlier in this section. So I think when he talks about a machine being a tool here, he means that in this sort of this attitude of where the human being and the machine have this doubly genetic relation to each other, the machine serves to extend human capacities rather than to subordinate them or be subordinated to them. So the tool in the sort of strict sense of the term, like a hammer or whatever, is just an extension, a sort of simple extension of a living being and its capacities, and then a machine is distinct from that in the sense that it stands in for the human individual or replaces the human, and it has its own motive power and so on. But then at a sort of higher level, when we have this adequate relation to the machine, we can sort of treat the machine as an extension of human capacities in a similar way to which the hammer or other simple tools are an extension of human capacities. So I think that's sort of the sense of what he talks about, of what he means here. Yeah, maybe we can link Angus is posting here. Maybe we can link the misuse of machines to parasitism in Volume 1. In this misuse, the machine serves the human, but in a way that it decreases human capacity by inducing a trance. Yeah, I think that's an interesting suggestion. So, like in parasitism, you have two entities that should be individuals, or that are in some degree individuals, but they sort of added together to produce less than two full individuals, or two like complete individualities, we could say, because the parasite sort of subtracts from the capacities of the host. And so, in the same way, here, when you have machines subordinated to human beings, um, they sort of subtract from the capacities of the human being, even though we have this feeling of superiority and dominance and so on in having these machines that serve us. At the same time, we are diminished by using the machines in this way, and sort of allowing ourselves to be hypnotized by this servitude of the machine. And here, I think there's an interesting bit at the beginning of this passage that we just read, about how there's a sort of vicious circle involved in this, what he calls the corrupted tastes of human beings, and so you have the this sort of consumer relationship to the machine, where you treat the machines as slaves, is sort of reinforced by commercial propaganda, as he puts it here, or advertising in general. So advertising sort of treats the machine as like, here is this new thing that's going to make your life so much easier and so much better. You're going to have so much more free time, or you're going to enjoy yourself more, or whatever. It always presents the machine as something that allows you to enjoy yourself more, or to something that serves you. Advertising doesn't tend to present like technical diagrams of how your phone or your car or whatever functions. Uh, it doesn't provide people with an understanding of the technical object. It presents them with this sort of fantasy image of this technical object that's going to make your life so much better. Um, and then there's this vicious circle, because precisely because of this corrupted taste, or this desire to have this machine that will serve you. The people that are making machines, or the companies that are making machines, have no incentive to do anything different than to produce new objects that have new ways of serving you. So this corrupted taste leads to the production of these new technical objects that are have these new and exciting ways of serving, rather than of developing really new technical principles of operation, and then, because the producers of these machines produce them for the sake of this corrupted taste, that means that the audience, or the rest of the society, is sort of has that taste reinforced. So it's this sort of vicious circle, where there doesn't seem to be any way out of it. But the one sort of exception to this use of the machine is scientific research, as he understands it here. So in scientific research, you have use of sometimes very sophisticated and elaborate technical objects. But at the same time, the operator of that technical object has an understanding of how they function. So you can think of something like a particle accelerator or something like that. It's not just it's not something that you can go to the store or order on Amazon or whatever. Um, it doesn't have that same commercial relationship or consumer relationship that other technical objects have. It's something that you have to design for yourself or uh, put together in some sort of scientific research project, and it puts the human being in connection with something extra human, this hidden aspect of nature that we saw at the beginning of the section that the technician has access to. And so the scientific researcher um, has this very different relationship to the machine or to the technical object in general that allows for a much more healthy or appropriate relationship to technical objects.
It seems like this is another instance of like a real middle that puts into communication or explains the relationship between two extreme terms, which here are subject as scientist and the object as nature. And it seems like throughout these two volumes, the middle is associated with like intelligibility, like the yellow, green, and human vision, or just like the idea of thinking the relation primarily before we think the terms. And it seems like what the machine does here is make the object intelligible to the scientist.
Yeah, so this is the other side. So we talked about the tool aspect of the machine, insofar as the tool, or insofar as the machine serves to extend human capacities and allows the human being to act on the machine, on the object. But there's the other side where the machine serves as an instrument, and here it conveys information from the object to the subject, and so this is the other side of the machine that is more sort of prevalent in scientific research as opposed to the sort of consumer use of machines. So in scientific research, the machine or the technical object in general uh, provides a way of uh, gathering information or making a mediation between the human being and some hidden aspect of nature. You can think of like an electron microscope or something that allows you to see viruses or tiny entities that, of course, human vision would never be able to see. Um, or you can think of like a radio telescope that allows measurements of distant galaxies and so on. Um, so you have different technical objects extend human perceptive capacities and capacities to absorb information from the environment. Um, and these technical objects extend that capacity and put us in touch with hidden aspects of nature. And so, because of this capacity to mediate between the human being as subject and the natural entity as object, is that mediatory capacity that makes the technical object more than just an object of consumption. And yeah, we've seen throughout volume one and again here in volume two how he always wants to um, sort of find a middle term between two extremes, but not like a mixture or a compromise or something like that, but a genetic middle. So it's um, a middle term, like precisely that yellow-green portion of the visual spectrum, that out of which the two extreme terms will be generated in this genetic way. Um, and this is sort of his general schema for how we understand a domain, how we come to grasp the functioning of some sort of domain of existence. is precisely that middle term that generates the two extremes. I'm going to suggest that we stop here. It's a little bit early, but the next section is about 10 pages long, so I think we can probably, about 8 pages long, so we can probably read the whole thing next time. And so this gives us a good stopping place for today, if that's okay with everyone.
That sounds good to me.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming out and for participating. Hope to see you next week, and then we should finish this text next week, and then the following week we'll start on the history of the notion of the individual, which is this giant. It's like 150 pages. It's basically like a mini book on the history of philosophy. With the notion of the individual as like the key principle. Yeah, it's basically all of Western philosophy, starting from the pre-Socratics up until Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche might be one of the last ones that he talks about. Okay, so thanks again, and see you next week.